Okay, before we start this book pill session, I want to tell you a little bit about Richard Todd. He was an editor for The Atlantic. He was described as a very generous and giving person, educated but not elitist, and all-around good person. He wrote this when he was 70, and he died at 78. And I think one chapter in this book might resonate with people who are of the red pill persuasion. The chapter's called Unreal. During the latter half of the 20th century, a notion, a conceit that once had been the province of artists, had come to belong to everyone. That notion was that the world is illusory, that all reality is subjective. Once, this was enough of a provocation to mock the bourgeoisie into discomfort and self-doubt. But then the bourgeoisie claimed the wisdom for their own. Through a mishmash of philosophy, popular art, and unadulterated science, relativity, the uncertainty principle, and even the drug culture, the unreliability of perception became commonplace. Every man a Pirandello. The Beatles sang of it. Nothing is real, nothing to get hung about. And people learned to exclaim with a roll of the eyes, unreal. In 1967, Jacques Derrida, then a name known to few, delivered a paper at Johns Hopkins University, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. The doctrine of deconstruction had arrived on our shores. If it was largely inscrutable, that did not mute its effect. After all, difficulty often creates wealth in an intellectual doctrine, opening the way for a multitude of disciplines to interpret and disseminate the word. Nor is internal contradiction a bad thing either, and deconstruction encompassed a major paradox. On the one hand, it taught that all language was to be distrusted. On the other, it suggested that everything was a text. There is no meaning outside of words, and yet words have no meaning, at least no stable meaning. It was a perfect doctrine for a subjective world. There was a wisdom at the center of this doctrine, an understanding of the tautology that haunts all language. But the wisdom had been available before Derrida. In retrospect, one can say about the deconstructionist movement, which has not yet ended, but which nevertheless has taken a place in history, that whatever else it did, it provided an enormous amount of fun for people. It was fun to practice and fun to disparage. There was, to be sure, a darker side to deconstruction. This case is perhaps best made by David Lehman in his book Signs of the Times. He argues that the theory is essentially nihilistic, and that nihilism matters, or can, or should. There is no ultimate meaning to which one can penetrate. There is only the constant deferral of meaning, the infinite play of signification. Lehman's objections are more than abstract. The book turns on the sinister story of Paul de Man, revered Yale English professor and deconstructionist critic. De Man, it turned out, had led another life in Nazi-run Belgium, where he was a collaborator and propagandist. Lehman argues convincingly that for de Man, deconstruction was a theoretical justification of the erasure of his past, a vast amnesty project for his collaboration. By his calling into question the absolute truth of anything, the absolute truth of his crime was washed away. The de Man story, Lehman says, forced one to examine two realms usually kept in separate compartments, the realm of literary theory and the realm of historical actuality. If one took it seriously, deconstruction could be very bad news. As one critic succinctly put it, it cruelly reduces the world to words. For most people who cared at all, it was not a tool of nihilism, just one of freedom. You didn't have to be a covert Nazi sympathizer to experience the liberation that deconstruction could bring. The notion that what other people held dear was simply a construct could relieve one of quite a bit of envy, longing, and intimidation. Of course, a strict adherence to the faith would have resulted in a world of chaos, but one could fudge. Even two deconstructionists can argue on what time to meet for lunch, and they'll not worry over much about the meaning of 1 o'clock, or what it constitutes, really, lunch. Similarly, many of the things that you held dear could be exempted from deconstruction. So you could have a pleasant life in the world of unexamined reality, but the freedom at any moment to call into question the validity of anything. For the academic, deconstruction was a social leveler. No more deference to the canon or to those who, by virtue of their education and status, laid special claim to it. Little wonder that the tweed jackets tended to deplore deconstruction, and the Levi's liked it. And ultimately, to be into theory was a status enhancer too. You knew the lingo, you were in the club. History had given us a joyous new way to be. It was skeptical onto paranoia, but a wholesome paranoia. It reveled in the disjunction of the modern world. It was kind of creative despair. It was postmodernism. It was great. But I think that for most everyone, including those who reveled in it, it was not quite enough. Like so many other excursions into indeterminacy, it was a flirtation with the enemy. Theory provided a way to be jaunty about something that was in fact a discomfort, an underlying unease about the nature of reality. This is the part you will like. In 1999, the movie The Matrix appeared. A straightforward little story if you could buy into its science fiction vision, which posited a futuristic world that was only imagining its own life. Most of its citizens lay comatose, their bodies warehoused, their brains connected to a vast computing network providing the illusion of experience. And the clever part. It's a shared illusion, because the individual brain is linked to those of the other zombies of the world. Evil machines run the show, of course, and a few escapees oppose them, and thus we have a plot. It turns out that a small body of academic literature preceded the movie, an exploration of what is known as the brain in a vat problem. It poses the question of whether you might actually prefer a life full of glory and passion and delight, even though it was all a delusion, and you were a disembodied brain receiving programmed stimuli. I've got to say that the brain in the vat problem holds limited interest for me, and The Matrix isn't my cup of tea either. Anything that's bathed in green light and involves the future makes me want a frothy comedy set somewhere like Saint-Tropez a few years back. But the movie had quite a following, and not just among sun-deprived, underweight young men either. It seems to have turned into a widespread anxiety. I don't mean that a large number of people are worried about being vat brains, but maybe they're worried about something for which the Matrix creators found a metaphor. Adam Gopnik in The New Yorker put the case simply. The idea that the world we live in isn't real is one that speaks right now to a general condition. Gopnik went on to say, the monopolization of information by vast corporations, the substitution of agreed-on fiction, imposed from above, for anything that corresponds to our own reality. The sense that we have lost control not only of our fate, but our small sense of what's real. All these things seem part of ordinary life now. Is this true? If it is not true, it has at least become an acceptable observation. Gopnik's vision of an Orwellian corporate consciousness machine might have seemed an extravagant remark not long ago, but who would bother to argue with it now? Well, a network executive would, and any number of people might have their quarrels, but it is the stuff of ordinary, intelligent conversation. Another movie came about at the same time, The Truman Show, more entertaining, less ghoulish, but similar in its appeal to our misgivings about the reality of our world. The Truman Show imagined its hero to be the victim of a lifelong hoax. He thinks he's living a normal life, but in fact he's the subject of a reality TV show, filmed in a bland Potemkin village, rather like Celebration, Florida, with a cast of hundreds of actors playing his neighbors. When, in his mounting unease, he tries to escape by crossing the man-made lake at the edge of town, he ultimately sails right into the painted sky. The notion that we live in a world of manufactured illusion had gotten such currency by the state of the century that an essayist in Harper's Magazine could go so far as to provide a taxonomy of contemporary unreality. Sample. Covertly unreal, realistic. Hair and shampoo ads. More or less undetectable digital effects, of which there are more of every day. The author was Thomas D. Zengotita, and his argument was more literal than that of The Matrix, but it amounted to the same lament. They're messing with our minds. He was not claiming coherent conspiracy exactly, but more nearly saying that we are reduced to stupefaction by the sheer stuff of contemporary culture, the tsunami of information that breaks over our heads. And that much of that information data, imagery, secondhand experience, whatever it is in fact tripped up by these contemporary illusionists, the people and institutions who are increasingly seen as one undifferentiated force, the media. Furthermore, they do their work so cleverly and with such energy, Dizengatita argues, that all the content on our information platform converges on this theme. There is no important difference between fabrication and reality. The occasion for this essay is the aftermath of September 11, 2001, attacks, and the writer's point was that even this event, so monstrous and overwhelming in its immediate effect, quickly became reduced for most people to a set of images. He writes that the attacks were an event so enormous, so horrific, so stark, that even the great blob of virtuality that is our public culture would be unable to absorb it. But it could. It has. Dizengatita's ultimate subject is numbness, our self-protective reaction to a dim knowledge that multitudes of images and emotions are being zapped at us, that our inner lives are now largely constituted by effects. You have to admit that there's something to this. A lot to it, really. On the one hand, you say, people have been telling us what to think for a long time. Before television, there was radio. And what about those old newsreels at the movies? What were they if not efforts to govern our emotions, and arguably more systematic and intentional efforts than any CNN, for instance, is inclined to undertake? Still, you don't have to have an impossibly long memory to recall a time when things seemed a lot different, when there was no CNN, no MSNBC or Fox, not to mention channels devoted to golf, cooking, money, sex, when there was no internet, and virtual meant more or less. The fundamental difference, perhaps, was not between truth and lies. It was simply that less of the world was seen second-hand, less was mediated and spun. Within the memory of some is a world that was understood primarily with our eyes or by words read on the page, which immediately invite the critical faculties that images tend to override. Not that words on the page haven't become part of the problem, because there are so many of them, an explosion of language. A magazine serves every conceivable interest. The number of books published annually in the United States climbed to more than 150,000 by the early century, so if you read 2 of them a week, you would read less than 0.1% of what was newly available. Never mind all the books you hadn't read from years and centuries before. But bring on the media conglomerate CEO, he or she will tell you that we are in the midst of a glorious revolution, in which more people know so much more. And isn't it true that we are more aware of places, events, even ideas in some form or other than we used to be? And isn't that a good thing? The political theorist Thomas Frank writes sardonically of this sort of claim. Since democracy means having more consumer choices, and information technology will vastly increase the power of our channel changers, hey, presto, more democracy. It's a good part. The trouble, or one trouble anyway, is that it's possible to be aware of more and to know less. Less, that is, in the sense of knowledge that has history, context, depth, experience. The marvelous things people now know how to say. Markets up. A lot of this is just short covering. We had him in Tora Bora and then we lost him. In the long run, it's not the deficit but the balance of trade. I want to maximize my omega-3, but I've got to eat lower on the food chain. The Turks will always be scared of the Kurds. This pseudo-knowledge is a gift from the paid chatterers who often themselves don't understand what they are saying. I don't mean that no one understands the trade deficit and that no one is an expert on Afghanistan, only that all of us some of the time, and most of us most of the time, borrow expertise and speak knowingly of subjects, some of which we had never heard of a few days ago, about events that happen in places we have never seen. There is probably a percentage of our knowledge that is second-hand, let's call it 78, beyond which we begin to feel unmoored no matter how accurate the knowledge is. Moreover, we may be deluded about the actual variety of what we are seeing and especially hearing. It is possible for the images to multiply, but the range of allowable thought to shrink. What can be shown and said on television has vastly expanded in one specific way, the personal, and especially the sexual. I wonder sometimes if the conservatives who rail against such language and image are not secretly laughing up their sleeves, as the networks move to the left on sex and to the right on everything else. For Bill Moyers, the determination of allowable thought is nothing less than a conspiracy. Virtually everything the average person sees or hears, outside of his or her own personal communications, he said in a recent speech, is determined by the interest of private, unaccountable executives and investors whose primary goal is increasing profits and raising the company's share price. Moyers, by his own account, has had the opportunity to confront this conspiracy of interests and feel its power directly. It's a more subtle thing for most news practitioners, less adventurous or less committed, a matter of absorbing the zeitgeist, until one knows instinctively what the outside limits of expression are. Moreover, there are infinite subtleties to the unwritten and for most part unspoken rules of what can be said. The mainstream, for all these years a cliché, is, if you think about it, an apt metaphor. The mainstream has on its sides countless back eddies, bayous, and wetlands for marginal and dissenting opinion, and as with a river, they relieve the possibility of flood. Thomas Frank has written about what he calls the new cultural miracle that can somehow co-opt any opinion. What we understand as dissent does not subvert, does not challenge, does not even question the cultural faiths of Western businesses, he remarks. Corporate executives are hipper than you can ever hope to be, because hip is their official ideology. That's them waiting to congratulate you on how outrageous your new style is, on how you shocked those prudes out there in the heartland. A confession. I love my media. I love my television, neat packager of the world, so likened that way to its natural enemy, the book. The media, more and more, are our community, Richard Schickel has said. I agree. It treats loneliness. I really miss my guy Tom. I watched Tom anchoring the news for years. Now he's gone. Sad. It was Tom's face that made all the difference. I used to watch for the moments while he earned his money, the millions of dollars a year paid by a grateful network for just that right little look at the end of the show. The moue, M-O-U-E, the half smile, the wince, or the ghost of a grimace. And what a narrow range of expression it was, like carving on a cameo. Grave or wry, puzzled or moved, all adjectives are only approximations of the emotion being conveyed, which always transcended the moment. What Tom said to me was, "Old pal, you and me in this crazy world, at least we're solid. God only knows what they're going to do next, but us, we've got our feet on the ground. The new guy, Brian, hasn't quite got it yet, but he will. He will." I know people who turn away in disdain from all television won't have it in their house. This may be a good idea. As they never tire of telling you, it frees up their time for higher pursuits. But it also strikes me as a form of that most popular, indeed epidemic disorder called denial. Television is the way we live now, and how can you hope to be in touch with your culture, broadly understood, without it? We say that TV news is entertainment, and it is, and we like it that way. At the dizzying, media-saturated start of the Iraq War, someone around here was overheard to say without irony, "I've got to go home and watch the war." I expect the same sentence was uttered in many places. There is so much news that you can't attend to it all, and you begin to select stories as if they were programs. The New York Observer a while back interviewed a number of prominent sorts, asking them what stories they just sort of skipped. "The latest space shuttle, the Columbia disaster," said Frank Rich of the New York Times. "I have to say I find it kind of embarrassing," said Ira Glass of Public Radio, "but I missed the entire Kosovo War." And it's not just television. Print is a spectacle of its own. In the spring of 2003, the New York Times flamboyantly fired a young reporter who had betrayed the paper by pretending to have interviewed people in person when he had spoken to them on the phone, and by borrowing or fabricating quotes. Bad stuff. But much of what he invented was trivial. He said the home of PFC Jessica Lynch, remember her and her daring rescue, overlooked cattle and tobacco fields. In fact, it overlooked no such things. But what did it matter? What, to anyone trying to understand the war, did PFC Lynch's story matter? The aspect of this case that might have given the Times most pause is that few of the victims of its misrepresentation complained. They thought this was the way of the world. In this way, they were falsely sophisticated. Reporters do care about getting their facts right, but the ordinary reader knew what the Times didn't want to admit, that much of the news exists to divert rather than to inform. And it doesn't do to think of ourselves as victims. It's just as possible that we are collaborators. Perhaps it is not just the media's presentation of news, but the news, the actual events, that has become entertainment in our imaginations. That is the argument of Neil Gabler in his book Life, the Movie. The conventions of popular culture, specifically the conventions of film, Gabler says, have become the way in which we perceive public events. It has long been a stylish thought that the movies have an unusual power over our minds. Years ago, at cinema's infancy, the French critic André Bazin suggested that the point of film was to achieve perfect replication of reality. He called this the myth of total cinema. And others have said that the movies went one better, that what was on film somehow exceeded life. Andy Warhol said, "I always thought that I was more half there than all there. I always suspected that I was watching TV instead of living life." People sometimes say that the way things happen in movies is unreal, but actually it's the way things happen to you in life that's unreal. The movies make emotions look so strong and real. Neil Gabler would agree. We see the world and we see our own lives. We borrow gesture, create scene, and craft a character, or, more frequently, we craft multiple characters for ourselves based on entertainment. We live in a movie, dreaming of celebrity. For some readers, this description will recall Walker Percy's novel The Moviegoer, published in 1961. Gabler himself does not choose to recall it, perhaps because the novelist was all too prescient too long ago. The book's hero, Bing Spalling, is a young New Orleans stockbroker, prosperous, with an easy way with women, and yet adrift in the world that seems to him illusory. He finds solace in the movies, not as an escape exactly, but because they seem to him more real than life. "I'm attracted to movie stars," he says, "but not for the usual reasons. It's their peculiar reality which astounds me." Binks tries to undergird his own tenuous identity by imagining himself on the screen. "I think it over Gregory peckishly," he remarks. In what is no doubt the book's best-known passage, he marvels at the magical authority a place suddenly takes on if it has the good fortune to appear in a movie. If he sees a movie which shows his very neighborhood, he says, it becomes possible for him to live, for a time at least, as a person who is somewhere and not anywhere. He calls what the movies do certifying, making things real. Percy's wisdom, though, was not about the movies. It was about the spiritual malaise that kept Binks from human connection. And I must register some skepticism about the magic of film. Maybe this is because I don't really think a movie has had lasting effects on me since the Saturday afternoon westerns taught me the essential lesson of plot. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. But in Gabler's view, we are all moviegoers now. Entertainment provides the tropes by which we understand ourselves and the great public events of our time. And often enough those events are themselves the result of a theatrical imagination. Gabler writes that entertainment is arguably the most pervasive, powerful, and ineluctable force of our time, a force so overwhelming that it has finally metastasized into life. Life, he goes on, would be the biggest, most entertaining, most realistic movie of all, one that played 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and a featured cast of billions. This is, like much of the book, what? A bit of sweeping? Yet there may be a worthwhile observation at the core. If we wanted to learn how to construct the world ourselves as a species of entertainment, then the world is all too eager to cooperate, using the conventions of film and television drama to secure the attention of the media and of us. Early in the rush of power felt by the new Bush administration, an anonymous official took it upon himself to boast of their ability to control perception. he told a reporter that they felt the reality-based media was obsolete. When we act, we create our own reality, as Frank Rich commented in The Greatest Story Ever Told, The Decline and Fall of Truth from 9/11 to Katrina. The same conservatives who once deplored postmodernism and moral relativism were now eagerly promoting a brave new world in which it was given that there could be no empirical reality in news, only the reality you wanted to hear, or that they wanted you to hear. At its most innocent, the effort consisted of what Daniel Borsting first identified as the pseudo-event, in which a ceremony was staged for a compliant press, and a broadcast as if it were real. We've come a long way since then. Not that such events don't continue, but now everyone understands the device and is inclined to judge it on its theatrical merits. President George W. Bush's now legendary carrier landing celebrating the end of the Iraq War took the form to new levels. It was in certain ways the perfect pseudo-event, a contrived speech of stagecraft without any practical purpose, whose value was entirely symbolic. But such events had better be perfect, because, for our part, we've all gotten terribly savvy about this sort of thing. Indeed, even as the event is underway, the observers in the media start talking not only about the event itself, but about the strategy behind it, and how effective it is likely to be, and we viewers expect them to provide such criticism. By doing so, they restore their sense of self, suggesting that they are not hoodwinked, even though they are making the spectacle possible with their coverage. We enter right into this meta-reporting with enthusiasm, all of us shrewd critics of the president's performance. And though one's feelings will be colored by politics, this analysis is really beyond partisanship. There is something a little degrading about the whole business, or so you might think. We are in effect judging our leaders on how successfully they are thinking of ways to deceive us. But so, in a way, like the reporters themselves, we rescue our dignity by showing that we understand full well what's up and are coolly beyond outrage. There is little doubt that the air is filled with demagoguery, the half-lies, the full lies, the renaming and repackaging. We salvage self-regard only by maintaining that we ought to be able to keep a clear head on these subjects. No one is beating the bottoms of our feet with sticks. And we purchase this dignity at a cost, the cost of detachment. Neil Gabler, in his characteristic extravagance, maintains that vast real-world events, wars for instance, are organized for their dramatic content, and one suspects that he would claim the whole Iraq War could be seen as motivated not by geopolitical or moral causes, but by dramatic purposes. Indeed, he says this explicitly about Gulf War I. Now, there's a word in here, before I start this passage, it's called horiest, not W-H, not thought-like, but horiest, H-O-A-R-I-E-S-T. So keep that in mind as I read this passage. And look it up in a dictionary. This is what Neil Gabler has to say about the Gulf War. The Gulf War was formulated like a World War II picture. It was meant to be short and sharp, its narrative lineaments clean, its heroes heroic, and its mustachioed villain, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, right out of the hoariest anti-Nazi propaganda. There's little reason to think that Gabler would feel any different about Operation Iraqi Freedom, in which he would no doubt argue. The theater became all the more brazen with the decision to allow a backstage view to the real-time war reporting of embedded journalists. It is appallingly true, at any rate, that we watched it as a spectacle. An exultant embedded journalist from CNN roared across the desert in a tank on the first day of the invasion, broadcasting live and shouting that this was a first. But as the war dragged on, surely this sense of theatricality faded away. We knew we were witnessing not a staged tragedy, but a real-life tragedy. At least we felt that we were more engaged, and perhaps we were. But you have to keep a cool eye on yourself when you are outraged over something that remains secondary to your life. From time to time the PBS evening news would show photographs of soldiers killed in action. Here in silence are 7 more. And I would find myself standing there in the kitchen, looking up from the cutting board perhaps, or perhaps just holding a glass of wine from which I respectively would not sip. And I would look at the screen and register the names and the age and the hometown, fleetingly imagine their lives, shaking my head sadly. And then I began to realize that there was something about this ritual that had nothing to do with pain on my part, something that was indeed shamefully self-enhancing. A few weeks before his death, I had lunch with an old friend and teacher, the literary and social critic Benjamin DeMott, the last time I would see him, as it turned out. He was writing something that would remain unfinished, but it was published many months later on just this subject, the falsity of feeling that public tragedy can inspire, though it took a darker turn than I could allow myself. The essay was called Battling the Hard Man, and it was a confession about being addicted to violence. Not violence enacted, of course, but violence observed from a mediated distance. When, as happens, the newscast ends without casualty totals, for soldiers or civilians or both, impatience and aggravation follow. I reached for the remote and commenced surfing, grim-looked intact, for the missing numbers, wanting terrible news to be worse, relishing catastrophe whose bottom can't be sounded. This condition developed quite swiftly. A key element in the condition, as comes clearer with time, is the accompanying cruelly neutral curiosity about what is happening to us inside and why, whether our occasional eruptions of moral concern have any weight whatever. The essay seemed to have passed by, exciting little to no attention. It may have been extravagant, but what I liked about it was not just its honesty, the honesty of a dying man, but its emphasis on consciousness as well. Although media are implicated, the blame is upon us. It is finally self-indulgent to blame the screen, any screen, for our failures of imagination. Our problem is not movies or television. It is whatever quality is within us that cannot connect with other lives. We can't blame technology for our mendacities. For that, we cannot even blame our mendacious leaders. We have ourselves to blame for our renegade feelings, and if we can't control them, we ought to at least face them. We must, to borrow a fine discredited phrase, win back our own hearts and minds.